Hi, and welcome to Carrier Rep. This week we tackle the topic of spectrum. There are some interesting new approaches to how wireless operators are thinking about spectrum. You have LTE moving into unlicensed frequencies at 5 gigahertz, either in the form of LTE-U or license-assisted access. Both AT&T and T-Mobile US have recently announced the results of trials in those areas, and Verizon's working on the technology as well. Meanwhile, there's a lot of interest in how spectrum sharing at 3.5 gigahertz is going to work out. You have a three-tiered access system there, and that's a technology that's expected to see more momentum in about the next year or so. Obviously, we just had the huge 600 megahertz spectrum auction where carriers were able to buy exclusive access to spectrum. T-Mobile's busy getting that spectrum online, and they're working on getting test sites running as soon as this month. So licensed spectrum isn't going away, but it does seem to be getting harder to come by. Then there's also the question of the state of the overall RF environment, both in terms of the noise floor, which the FCC has been thinking about, as well as the potential impacts from the Internet of Things. When you turn on millions or billions of new IoT devices, what impact does that have on the RF landscape? So to discuss those questions, I took some time to pick the brain of Dan Hays, who is a principal analyst with PwC. Here's that interview. This is Kelly Hill with RCR Wireless News. I'm here today with Dan Hays. How are you doing, Dan?
Great, Kelly. Thanks so much.
Great. So we are going to have a little bit of a chat about spectrum. I think there's some interesting things going on in this space. We've got 3.5 gigahertz that's going to be coming online sometime in the next maybe year plus, maybe 2018 timeframe. We have LTE moving into unlicensed. Which T-Mobile and AT&T have both been trialing and testing and starting to turn up. And I think, both of those things are sort of a little bit of a shift from the traditional spectrum paradigm of, I'm going to buy a whole bunch of blocks of spectrum, although T-Mobile just did this, so that paradigm hasn't completely disappeared. But I'm sort of curious as to, how you see this paradigm and how both industry and regulators are thinking about spectrum resources, how you see that evolving.
Yeah, no, it's a great topic, and it's one I always enjoy talking with the RCR team about. I think what we see with spectrum is that the landscape is really starting to evolve very quickly as the mobile industry has started to mature. In years past, it was a hard-fought battle with billions of dollars invested to really own and control as much spectrum as you could to support your customers, particularly below 2 megahertz. In the low and mid band spectrum was really, as many have called it, the beachfront property for mobile networks. Well, the times have changed, and I think the mobile industry is having to change along with it. We've seen, as you said, we've seen some continued interest in licensed spectrum, particularly in the very attractive lower frequencies. There's definitely a change of mentality taking place within the mobile industry. We would argue that a lot of this is actually driven by that maturing of the industry, the flattening of the net adds that are taking place across the industry. And then, the constant price wars that have now broken out over the last couple of years among the incumbent operators, really battling for what is a fairly stable pie within the industry. In that type of environment, it's terribly hard for the mobile operators to justify spending $5-10 billion or more on spectrum. So what we've seen is they're now shifting their attention to alternative sources. We're not willing to, right? You and I don't want to pay more every month for our bills so we can get more bandwidth, but we want the more bandwidth. So when we need extra spectrum, the operators need to find some ways to get it on the cheap. And so some of the dynamics that you spoke of, whether it's fully unlicensed spectrum, whether it's license-assisted access, whether it's sort of a mediated access, like some of the SAS approaches we're seeing with the 3.5 band, and that have been proposed for 5 as well, or some of these newer approaches, even for advanced Wi-Fi that have been proposed. Those are all ways for operators to get their hands on some spectrum, but not really have to pay for it. So it's actually a pretty good deal for them, right? You need your most precious resource, and you can get it sort of for free. It sounds like a nice business plan for me.
So, but there's trade-offs there, though. That whole issue of, okay, I might be able to use, 3.5, but I'm not going to be the only one operating in that spectrum. Or, I can aggregate my, a channel at 5 gigahertz with LAA or LTEU, but I'm still going to have to deal with the fact that there are, Wi-Fi devices operating in that spectrum. So it seems like there's, you have control, and control is something that the carriers really like when it comes from their, comes to their spectrum, as opposed to kind of that cost and capital investment side of it.
Yeah, the word of the day here is probably uncertainty. The carriers really don't like uncertainty when it comes to the quality of service that they can provide to their customers. Now, the flip side of that coin is, as we all know as mobile users, there's uncertainty today in the networks that we have. There are dead spots, there are holes, there are areas of degraded performance, there's network congestion at times, right? Go out to your favorite ballpark or get stuck in traffic on a busy highway, and you know exactly what I'm talking about. But the reality is operators don't really like that degree of uncertainty. So many of them are going to have to put in place some new capabilities to manage that uncertainty, and maybe have multiple tools in the toolkit, the Spectrum toolkit, to help them, provide at least some minimum level of quality of service to their users and to the devices that they're using. This is where the portfolio approach comes in, right? Unlicensed spectrum or any of the many variants of it is really going to be probably just one of a handful of tools that the carriers use. And let's be honest, they already utilize a lot of it today, right? By most accounts, probably somewhere between 80 and 90% of traffic on mobile devices actually rides over Wi-Fi networks and never hits licensed spectrum from a carrier. So the operators today are really already benefiting from unlicensed spectrum in a very significant way. And we've seen them in the last year, maybe even just 6 months, starting to really admit that and open up to it, versus the days of a decade ago when some of them actually wouldn't let you use Wi-Fi with your mobile device. So it's a new paradigm. It's going to require some new capabilities, different approaches to planning, and different approaches to managing network performance. And we've even seen, some pretty crazy approaches out there in terms of like real-time auctions of spectrum capacity, to whoever the highest bidder is at that time willing to pay for it. We've never had things like that, and will anybody go for it? It's yet to be seen.
Yeah, no, you're right. We have had that at least thrown out there as a possibility. I'm not sure. There hasn't necessarily been anybody taking them up on that yet, but we'll see. So one other thing that I wanted to talk about is, so IoT. We are talking about a spectrum environment that, where carriers are already, I think, fairly pressed for capacity, at least in some bands. And we're talking about, in the context of IoT, bringing on millions and or billions of new devices. Some of them in unlicensed frequencies, which if you're talking about 2.4 is already really congested. Other unlicensed, bands. And then, obviously some of that will be in licensed bands as well. So what are the implications there for the radio environment of adding all of these new devices? I know the FCC has, they've done an inquiry of, should we study the impacts on the noise floor over the past 20 years and try and figure out, what the radio environment actually looks like today. Because people are worried that IoT is ultimately going to end up being stifled, because of the radio because of the radio environment, and that's also going to cause problems for licensed band holders because of noise and interference, unintentional radiation, intermod, all kinds of technical things that happen when you bring on a whole lot of things that are emitting RF energy that didn't used to.
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and with the explosion of connected devices and of devices that are utilizing or adjacent to bands being used for communications, noise floor issues and interference issues have continued to be on the rise. I think when we look at those, there's a few levers that we see people needing to pull. First one is you've got to be a diligent and a respectful member of the RF community when it comes to designing networks and deploying networks, because we're all having to live in an increasingly congested environment. That's not easy by any means, and it comes down to how we design and build networks, how we manage them, and it also comes down to our ability to being able to detect when there are interference and noise issues. These millions or billions of IoT devices that you mentioned is perhaps a very scary future for all of us, right? The ITU, when it put out its initial specifications for 5G a while back, talked about the need to accommodate 1 million IoT devices or 1 million connected devices per square kilometer. That's dizzying in many respects, but it's maybe an indication of where things are going. Now, not every IoT device will be connected to a mobile network, right? They may be on Bluetooth, they may be on Wi-Fi, they may be hardwired, low power, wide area networks. There's lots of solutions for them. But there are many that are going to wind up on mobile networks, and this is a fact we're going to have to deal with. So we need to be thoughtful about how we design them, how we design their usage of networks, right? If we look back even 10 years ago to when when the smartphone boom really started, we had some of these same issues with early applications in smartphones. They taxed the networks because they weren't necessarily designed to operate efficiently, to minimize their use of data, to have signaling protocols that worked well with, at the time, 3G and even 2G networks. We need to continue that discipline of designing effective communications protocols for all of this. But it's a tough one to manage, and in an environment where we're talking about billions and billions of devices, it's going to be even harder to make sure that they're all certified, they're all operating within the standards. The other lever we look at is from a regulatory standpoint. The lever that the regulators have as the stewards of our spectrum is to really make sure that any device, whether it's licensed, unlicensed, or otherwise, that any device is a respectful user of the spectrum, meaning that they're transmitting within their authorized bands, that they are adhering to the noise limitations, and that even receivers, which we don't really have great standards on today, even receivers are designed to optimize how they're working and not rely on networks that aren't being compliant and respectful users of the spectrum that's out there. That's the only way we're going to scale up to these billions and billions of, tens of billions, I guess, of IoT devices.
Yeah, and I think there's, some, so we have a global supply chain, not that we haven't in the past, but, I think, a couple of the comments that I've seen on the FCC stuff is, sometimes things that were meant to operate in other countries end up here.
Yes.
Totally, they can really cause some problems. Wi-Fi access points that were meant to operate in different countries, and and then you have sort of the low cost aspect of this that I think comes into play for a lot of IoT. That LED light that can be controlled from your smartphone. Yes, it's more expensive than a regular bulb, but they really still want to try and make the cost of of each individual piece basically as low as it can be, particularly for the consumer market. those are some competing interests there. Ultimately you hope that people really think about design and protocols and the influence that has not only on network but on battery life too. But man, it's going to be there are probably going to be some problems if that doesn't actually play out that way.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of it is we're going to have to be diligent and control some of those things. So, a few years ago, I was using a portable hotspot of sorts that utilized some licensed spectrum. And one of the things that really caught my attention was to utilize it, you actually had to have a GPS antenna attached to it, not because it actually needed GPS, but actually because it needed to check and make sure it was within the United States and could be used lawfully, that you weren't taking it to another country. So your point's very well taken. We have to design these devices in ways that ensure that we don't get ourselves in situations where they're being used in environments where they shouldn't be. I was reading some research yesterday on some interference issues as well. And, jamming is also still an issue. In fact, I would say it's a bigger issue than ever, given some of the use of these networks, right? Where we have wireless networks being used for sensing and security and safety purposes. The last thing we want is somebody to be able to then come in with a jammer. Some of these you can buy them online for $10, and you can go take out an entire airport. You could go take out, a huge network of sensors very inexpensively, and it is a little scary. So designing these systems to be resilient is of utmost importance.
Yeah, no, and people think about it in terms of context of, they might want it for the movie theater or for a school, their classroom, but
Yes.
anybody can pick them up and use them. And
yeah, that was a great one. I hadn't read this story, but here in Washington, D.C., there was apparently a group of students that had a drone club, and they wanted to fly their drones in the gym at the local high school. But within D.C., there's a perimeter that you can't fly drones because of our federal government and the institutions we have here. They actually bought a GPS jammer and installed it in the gym at the high school so that they could defeat the drones sensors and utilize that spectrum within the no-fly zone. This is high school students. It doesn't take a lot.
Yeah, and and people are more RF savvy than you give them credit for sometimes, I guess.
That's right.
So, okay. Well, Dan, thank you so much for the time today. Really appreciate the perspective. I just want to remind everybody that we do have a special report that came out this week on spectrum monitoring, testing, and analyzing that gets into a lot of these issues more in depth. So thanks for the time, Dan, and your perspective.
Thanks. Always a pleasure.
So there's obviously a lot going on in this area. I'm going to put in one more plug for the special report that I wrote on spectrum monitoring, testing, and analysis that gets into some of these issues more in depth. That went up this week and is available as a free download on rcrwireless.com. If you're interested in learning even more, we have an archived webinar also from this week that you can access via rcrwireless.com. So thanks for joining me for Carrier Wrap. See you next time.